And as folks are signing in, if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be great, so we can get a sense of who is in the room. So if you could drop your name, pronouns, organization in the chat, that would be great. Additionally, we'd like to get a sense of who is joining us today and what sectors you're from, so we can really get to know the audience. Sometimes webinars are not really the best at lending themselves at an interactive experience. So hopefully we can have a few polls here for you to answer to tell us who you are and which organizations you represent. So we'll also just take a quick second to run a poll so that you all can tell us. Oh, the chat is disabled. Apologies. We will try to enable the chat so you can introduce yourselves.
It should be fixed now.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. And then we'll go ahead and just ask a few quick questions in a poll about who is in this room to just orient us to the presentation that we're having today. So we have a couple quick questions here. First is asking about your familiarity with DACA, your familiarity with work visas, advanced parole, and really the hat you're wearing today when you're coming to the space. So we'll let folks take a few minutes to answer those 4 quick questions, which I think will be really useful as we proceed in today's conversation. Okay, I think we could probably wrap up the poll. It looks like most folks, thankfully, are quite familiar or somewhat familiar with DACA. Less familiarity with work visas, but still over 50% that are at least somewhat. And then similarly with advanced parole, slightly more folks that are familiar or very familiar. And then a really interesting mixture of folks who are directly DACA recipients or folks who are employers of DACA recipients or just other folks who are interested in learning more about the content that we're sharing today. So hopefully that's useful context for our other presenters that you'll hear from momentarily. All right, so we can proceed to the next slide and talk a little bit about who we are and what we're here to share with you today. So as I mentioned, my name is Rich Whipple, and I work with the city's Office of Civic Engagement and Immigrant Affairs. And I'm joined by my colleague, Kathy Jin, with the Bay Area DACA Initiative. And Kathy will speak more in just a few minutes, and I'll just do some quick framing about why we are hosting this in partnership with Kathy and team and the other seasoned experts that are here with us today. So really quickly, I know a lot of folks on the next slide will kind of talk about the work we've been doing as a city and county to support DACA. And a lot of the folks that are here, we know are part of our important community networks and city networks. So we wanted to thank you for being here today and for being part of this important conversation. Our work briefly to support DACA really started shortly after it was created with free immigration legal services funded at the request of community partners, many of whom I see here today. We, years later, expanded our support work to include immigration fee assistance that we do in partnership with groups like Mission Asset Fund. And we've also launched really important programs to make sure DACA recipients and folks without any form of status have access to professional development opportunities and income generation opportunities. So I know a lot of folks here are also alumni of our Dream SF Fellows program, so we wanted to welcome you as well. The city also has been pretty vocal around advocating for DACA. Our city attorney's office has been part of the amicus briefs and the litigation that is still ongoing around DACA, which we will hear more about in a moment. So all this to say that this is something that matters a great deal to our communities, to our city, and to the Bay Area. And I know a lot of you have been working hand in hand with each other and with the city many years to support DACA recipients and all immigrants regardless of status. And this conversation is especially important to make sure that we're doing what we can proactively to support folks. So a little bit more framing on the next slide before I turn it over to Kathy and we launch into the details of this presentation. Why this really matters at this moment in time. We know that the DACAmented community and really all immigrants, of course, are an incredibly important part of our city and our community workforce. You know, through our Fellows program, we've seen a beautiful pipeline of folks that we see working across industries, really holding up and holding together many of our social safety networks and many of the key services that we know community and the city rely on. We also know that the climate we're in this moment is not cute. There's a lot of negative xenophobic rhetoric. It seems to be escalating and accelerating in this election year. And we know that we need to be proactive in thinking about ways to support and protect all immigrants, especially at this moment and in this juncture, folks like DACA who may be facing a backward step in light of potential court rulings. So this is really about looking and exploring at creative pathways that will support DACA recipients, but also everybody. You know, we're mindful that many immigrants never qualified for DACA in the first place and still do not. And we want this conversation to be a starting point for ways to support everybody, not just DACA recipients. So really, again, my thanks and gratitude to all of you for being here, regardless of your role, and to our speakers for taking the time to lend their expertise and share with us some of these models for how we can begin this proactive stance. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kathy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Rich, for getting this together. I'm remembering that just a few months ago, my emails to Rich were going into spam, and I tried reaching Rich from so many different ways because I knew, knowing Rich, that he would never not respond and he was going to be on this. And the fact that we got 160 people to register for this webinar today was total evidence of what I knew to be true of Rich's commitment. And I just am so thankful to you, Rich, for all the joy and positivity that you always bring to every conversation and every issue that we've ever worked on together. So again, thank you. So as many of you already know, my name is Kathy Jin, and I was the co-founder and executive director of Immigrants Rising for over 17 years. I'm happy to be here with so many people that I've worked with at that organization for a long time. In that role, I had the privilege of working closely with so many undocumented individuals, many of whom were able to legalize. And in that process of seeing people legalize, I saw both the incredibleness of that journey, but also how challenging it was, and that pathways were not obvious. They were difficult to navigate, that individuals were often misinformed and ignorant about their eligibility for different options, things like cost and limited legal service capacity, mental health challenges, and of course, the extreme challenges in our immigration system were all barriers to legalization. And so I'm extremely excited now to be able to be working exclusively on a project that is focused on legalization. And as you'll see on this slide right in front of you, I'm now leading something called the Bay Area DACA Initiative. The goal of that initiative is to legalize at least 40% of the 20,000 Bay Area DACA recipients or DACA recipients and DACA eligible individuals in the Bay Area. This is a 4-year initiative. It's a $13 million initiative, and it's funded by the Crankstart Foundation. We can go to the next slide. We are right now in year 1 of this initiative, and our efforts are focused on proactively and aggressively preparing for the termination of DACA. As many of you know and have been part of since Trump was elected, we have been talking about the vulnerability of DACA and the need to do something about it. And while I'm extremely grateful and respectful of all of the advocates and attorneys and organizers, so many of you in this room who've been able to keep this program alive for the past 8 years so that we're still talking about this after 8 years, there is so much to be done to prepare DACA individuals and all the organizations that depend on the leadership of DACA individuals to transition into something better than DACA. And I'm really excited to be part of that. So our primary activities that we're focused on in the Bay Area DACA Initiative are administrative advocacy, to be trying to widen the existing pathways, direct support to DACA individuals and employers, building the infrastructure that we need to be able to transition so many individuals into a better legal status, and education and outreach like we're doing today. I can transition to the next slide. So the purpose for today's webinar, as you probably got from the title of the webinar, is to teach you about or help you learn about legalization options for DACA recipients and the concrete ways that nonprofit employers can help their DACA individuals, DACA staff, be able to get on a path to legalization. We hope that you are going to walk away, sorry, next slide. We hope that you're going to be able to walk away today with a better understanding of the current status of the DACA program. It sounds like we have a lot of people who are very informed about it, but we want to level set a little bit, understanding of what's going on with the DACA program right now. We want to share a little bit about potential scenarios and a timeline for the termination of DACA. We want to talk about the importance of DACA individuals exploring pathways to legalization. Why is this important? Why is it urgent? And we want to share knowledge about potential pathways to legalization. We also want to share, as I said, opportunities for nonprofits to get engaged and to help. And then we're also going to be able to share the experience of a DACA individual and their employer who helped them through a legalization process. We have an amazing panel on the next slide here. We have Lizia Dalla, formerly the press director from Forward.us, who was a former DACA recipient who was able to get support from Forward to legalize. Tiffany Lawrence from Forward.us. They're going to be kicking us off with sharing their experience. Then Krishna Avila and Dan Berger, staff project attorneys at Path to Papers, which is a new entity at Cornell Law School focused on employment-based law. Karen Tumlin and Elia Rojas are going to talk about the advanced parole program they have through Justice Action Center. And Rico Valerio is going to share his experience being a participant on that advanced parole program. So again, thank you all of you for being here. And now we're going to get started with Lizia and Tiffany. So welcome to you both. I think you're there. I can't see you. I can only see myself. Yes, you are there. Hello.
Hi.
So, Lizia, you are a former DACA recipient now. Congratulations, legal permanent resident. You were the former press director at Forward.us. You are now elsewhere. I'll let you share that if you want. And Tiffany Lawrence, also here, Vice President, Chief Human Resources Officer at Forward.us. So I'm going to start directing a question to Lizia. So Lizia, could you tell us briefly about your experience with DACA? It seems like we have a lot of people who know a lot about DACA, but how did you benefit from the program? And maybe more importantly for this audience, when did you start feeling like you needed something more stable than DACA?
Sure. So I will take you back a little bit further. Almost 30 years, 1996 is when I first came to the US. I was 6 years old and my family and I immigrated from Canada. Obviously, immigration laws had changed over time. We had tried many times to get legal status. And when I was a junior in college, I found out that I was undocumented because a lawyer had essentially filed paperwork late and just mishandled paperwork. This was before DACA was in existence. There were no protections at all for people like me. And during my college graduation day, I was literally sitting at my college graduation ceremony, and that was the day that DACA was announced. And what that program did was essentially, after I had submitted all of my information to the government, my address, the names of my family, my, just every, photographs, a whole history of kind of my life in the US, the government issued me a 2-year renewable work permit and temporary protection from deportation. And for me, DACA, I mean, it changed my life. I had taken out over $100,000 in student loans to be able to go to Northwestern. I got a journalism degree and needed to find a way to pay that off. With my work permit, I got a job. I started also covering crime at the local newspaper on weekends. I started a resume writing business. And with DACA, I was able just to make longer term financial decisions. I was able to buy a car. It really gave me, protection from deportation. When my office had work conferences, it allowed me to get on a plane and travel. It really, really did change my life. And then in 2016, I moved up to Washington, D.C. joined Forward and began working full-time advocating for immigration reform. We decided, I think around the time that Trump was in office, we knew that there were a lot of lawsuits, there was litigation moving against DACA, and decided that it was extremely tumultuous and DACA was not here to stay forever. It was never meant to be a permanent program. And so we started having conversations about how to transition from DACA and temporary status to something that was more permanent. And I think especially with the potential of a second Trump term, which is another conversation that we are having now and another kind of reality that we're looking at, it was really important for us to find ways to legalize folks. And I feel really fortunate that I was able to work with Tiffany and the team at Forward and was able to move through that process.
Thank you so much, Lizia. I'm going to now ask Tiffany a question. Tiffany, what motivated Forward to help Lizia and your other DACA staff improve their immigration system?
So one of the things that Forward works on is advocacy around immigration. So we really work to help to create the conditions that can result in effective policy change, to actually create policy change. And so because we're doing that for the communities that we serve, we also want to make sure that we're doing that for our staff. And so it just made sense. Because of the spaces and places that we were in, we're aware of what some of the employment-based options were, and we're able to present those options and explore that with our staff.
And Tiffany, can you give just a brief sense of some of the other support that you've been able to give to your DACA staff and other staff that have temporary status?
Yeah, so we have quite a few benefits in that space. We have some advanced parole benefits that we provide to employees, to our DACA recipients, and really have had a concerted effort to make sure that every person has had the opportunity to experience advanced parole, to take advantage of that, and some additional resourcing around that with helping cover the cost for the flights and the hotel accommodations while they're traveling, and also providing the legal support and consultation every step of the way to make sure that they can feel as safe and as supported as possible as they're maneuvering through the AP process. We also have some additional benefits for our DACA recipients, as well as folks looking to adjust status. So we cover a myriad of different legal fees, application fees, whether it's the DACA renewal fees, and then they have access to legal consultation. And we really try to reduce the barriers to access, meaning that they know who their contacts are. They don't have to go through HR. If there's something that they need, they have direct access. So we really try to make sure that we sort of understand what the needs are, what the real-time needs are. We also have a DACA Leadership Committee, a group of impacted folks that really help to inform the policies that we have and to make sure that they're the right supports at the right time.
Excellent. And we will, in our follow-up to everyone, share a document that Forward has put together with some best practices for employers, and outlines a lot of the things that Tiffany just mentioned about the support they provide to their own employees. So Lisa, you mentioned getting a green card, and I wonder if you, Lisa and Tiffany, can talk about how did you find out that this green card through work was going to be possible? Who informed you about that option, and how did you start down that journey of pursuing it?
Tiffany, you want to take this, or do you want me to?
Well, so as I mentioned, just the work that we do in the advocacy space, and we're working with lawmakers, we're working with a variety of stakeholders. So we're looking to advance policy change in this space. So we're aware, just in those circles that we're in, and the advocacy work that we're doing day in, day out. And so that's how we became aware of it, and how we stay abreast now as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to mention that Forward is not a legal services provider. We were not doing that kind of work in-house. And so we knew that it was possible to, potentially, I think, petition, but we still had to, identify an attorney that could walk us through the process. And I thought, for me, that felt really important, especially, going through this process for the first time. I think it's important just to remember that you don't have to have an immigration attorney on staff in-house to be able to do this. There are a lot of organizations out there that are willing to offer that counsel and to walk you through the process. And for us, it was also a new experience. And so, you know, I also want to name that, you know, with DACA, I think what was really important is that DACA was very beneficial, but it was also very limiting because it created a lot of uncertainty for me and also for the employer. I had to renew my DACA protections every 2 years, and it takes many months to renew those protections and that work permit. And so every year you are looking at paperwork, and every other year you're filing an application, paying those fees. You know, in terms of what I wanted to pursue in life, I always wanted to go to law school, and law school is 3 years, but my DACA is only valid for 2 years. And so you're really, as a DACA recipient, having to make very kind of short-term decisions about your life and about your career. And I think, you know, the employers are really kind of struggling with that uncertainty and those time constraints as well. And at the time that we had started looking to petition me so that I was able to adjust my status, we were able to get an attorney who really guided us through that process and worked with us along that way. And I feel really fortunate in particular that at Forward, there was a senior staff member who was designated to sort of almost be like a buddy to me, who was checking in on the process, who I wanted to and welcomed, you know, to sit in on those meetings and to just kind of go through the process together. Because again, I had never, you know, this was very new for me. And so it was really helpful just to have an internal advocate who could support me and who was just willing to also provide like the emotional support, because it is a very, you know, it can feel kind of tumultuous, I think, and very uncertain because you don't know if you will get approval at the end of that process.
Got it. Can you also talk, or thank you for that. You talked a lot about the limitations and the uncertainty of DACA. Can you share a little bit about what it's like now to have a green card? How has that felt different? What if anything has remained of uncertainty? What has been resolved?
I was approved for a green card in the summer of 2020. And I think looking back, I can't believe it's almost been 4 years. I think for me, sorry, I always cry when I talk about this, because I think life looks so different for me in a way that I could not have imagined. It took 25 years for me to get my green card in this country. And a couple weeks ago, I was able to visit my grandma in Canada for the first time. I was not able to visit my 2 other grandparents who passed away when I was not able to travel across the border. So just even being able to like be reunited with family was very important to me. And I feel very fortunate to be able to have that reunion and to be able to know my family and to be able to experience that. I think it's something that a lot of people take for granted, is the whole idea of family reunification. But for me, that was incredibly important. What getting my green card was, you know, it allows me to make longer term plans for my life. So, for example, with DACA, in some states, you're able to get a driver's license, but that driver's license is only valid for 2 years. With my green card, I have a driver's license that doesn't expire for 10 years. It's really the little things that are the big things. It gave me the chance to, you know, apply to a graduate program in a different country. It allowed me to pursue other career opportunities. I, you know, stayed working at Ford and in the immigration advocacy space for a long time, and then recently decided to transition to a job at Amazon, which for me, you know, when I had DACA, did not feel possible. I think that there's also something to be said just about peace of mind and knowing that I can wake up tomorrow and that like I will not get deported from the only country that I have like memories of. So I think that the truth is that DACA is going away. And if you have the ability to protect your staff, you should absolutely do it, because there's very few avenues for DACA recipients to be able to adjust their status, and being petitioned by an employer is one of those very few ways. And so you have the ability and the opportunity. If you have, you know, that chance, please take it, because it means it makes a world of a difference. And it really does. It has changed my entire life.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to ask 2 things right now. I'm going to ask one question to Tiffany to end up this interview, but I also ask that all of you on this call send your love and appreciation to Lesia. She actually has another meeting she has to be in 2 minutes. So if you could just show that, that would be great. And Tiffany, can I end a question with you? What would you recommend to employers who are figuring out how to begin supporting their DACA employees like Lesia?
Yes, so Forward has been around for 10 years, and we have folks that are really passionate about these issues, and that, we're doing everything that we can to help our staff and to push the movement. And so we have some resources, Informed Immigrant, that is a great resource for employers and for DACA recipients, just to kind of sort of understand the landscape and help to sort of demystify some of those things. But I would just say organizations like yours and folks on this panelists on this call to seek that information, and just as much as we can, and educate folks around what the employment-based opportunities are. I would also say that for employers, as Lesia mentioned, having a trusted partner in terms of the law firms that we can work with, the legal counsel, we formed really strong relationships and bonds with those folks, and we're entrusting them with our precious talent in our organization to sort of shepherd us all through what can be very scary processes and not knowing the outcome. So making sure that you have good partners that can help to walk you through those things, and so that you're doing it in a way that is, feels safe and hopefully effective.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Again, I promised Lisa she would get to her meeting at the half hour. So goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany, too.
Thank you.
I'm gonna now we're gonna transition into Krishna and Dan from the Path to Papers team. Krishna, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you all, and thank you, Kathy. Thanks, Lesia, and Tiffany at Forward. Very powerful story, and thank you all for joining. And I see that we have a few questions already. We'll try to answer some of those. But yeah, as the title suggests, in this section, Dan and I will provide a brief update on the DACA policy and where it stands, talk about our new nonprofit project called Path to Papers, who we are and how we can support. And then lastly, we'll provide a general overview of employment-based immigration visas and how employers can help DACA recipients obtain these. Next slide, please. So I know many of you are already familiar with DACA and what's happening with the policy, but we want to provide a refresher. As some of you know, DACA is an administrative policy that was created in 2012 by the Obama administration. Persons who are eligible for the DACA policy have been able to receive temporary protection from deportation, have been able to work, they get a work authorization, and they can travel under limited circumstances. And later on, you'll hear about the traveling aspect. Importantly, as many of you know, DACA does not lead to a permanent lawful status. And as was mentioned previously, you have to renew it every 2 years. So it is sometimes a struggle for folks who have to renew their DACA. Next slide, please. So to provide you with a few statistics about DACA recipients, so right now there's an estimated 580,000 persons who are benefiting from the program nationwide. We have 183,000 here in the state of California alone. And if we're looking at San Francisco, there's an estimated 11,000 DACA recipients that we all want to help support and figure out ways for them to get other options outside of DACA. Next slide, please. And when we look deeply at who DACA recipients are, there are a lot of statistics out there, but most importantly for this webinar, we wanted to mention that when we look at DACA recipients, we know that one, they possess advanced levels of education, and then two, the vast majority of them are in the workforce. So you can see some stats here on the slide. So for those who, when we look at the education levels, we see that nationwide, there's about 47% of DACA recipients who have some college or more. And here in San Francisco, we actually have a larger percentage, 67%, who have some college. And in the workforce, we see that the stats are similar. Nationwide, there's about 79% who are currently working and 78% who are in the San Francisco metro area. These are important because when we're looking at employment-based options, the level of education and being employed is often helpful when we're assessing whether someone's eligible. That's not to say that this is a requirement for all employment-based immigration options, but for some of them, especially when we're looking at education, it does help. Next slide, please. So why is it important to explore other options for folks with DACA? So many of you know that that DACA is temporary, and as I mentioned, it by itself does not lead to permanent lawful status like a green card or U.S. citizenship. But also many of us who organized during the Obama days and fought for the administration to create what was eventually DACA knew that DACA was vulnerable to ending one day. And sure enough, that's kind of where we are today. So we saw that the Trump administration previously tried to end the program during his first presidency. And now what we have is a pending lawsuit that's challenging the legality of DACA itself. Where we're at with the lawsuit, basically a lower court already agreed and said that DACA is unlawful. And the Biden administration appealed that to the Fifth Circuit. That's where we're at right now, waiting for a decision from the Fifth Circuit. But knowing the history of the Fifth Circuit, we expect that the Fifth Circuit is also going to say that DACA is unlawful. But as some of you know, most likely after that, it will get appealed once again to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's really where we're worried, because if the U.S. Supreme Court decides that DACA is unlawful too, then that's probably going to mean the end of DACA. That decision, obviously we don't know exactly when it would come, but we're expecting a decision if the U.S. Supreme Court decides to take the case for them to rule sometime next year, so summer or fall of 2025, which is, I mean, if you think about it, that's not too long from today. So that's why we really want to encourage you all to start exploring these options today. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Obviously, I think some of you might not be as familiar with DACA, but when we talk about what it means for the policy to end, this really means that if the U.S. Supreme Court or the courts in general decide that DACA is unlawful, this could mean that people who have benefited from DACA will be left without the ability to work lawfully, and will also be at risk of being deported. So again, this is why it's important to assess for other options, for other ways for them to get a form of legal status that's more permanent. And this is why it's also important for employers. Employers can play a key role in assessing and helping DACA recipients to see if there are ways for them to sponsor their DACA employees. So that's kind of the summary of what has been happening with DACA and how employers can help. Next slide, please. So this is where we come in. So who are we as Pad to Papers? We're a new nonprofit venture. We're housed at Cornell Law School, and we're here to help. We're here to support both DACA recipients who are wanting to explore whether they're eligible for these types of options. And we're also supporting employers who have DACA recipients as employees and want to figure out ways to help them. And I'll talk about the specifics as to how what services we're offering, but we're really focused on immigration work visas, employment-based options, and other pathways to legal permanent residency. Next slide, please. So now I'm bringing in our expert, Dan Berger, my colleague at Pad to Papers, to help us really get more information about these types of options, I know that there are a few immigration attorneys who are on this webinar and they really want to know the details. We won't go over the exact details on the different employment-based categories because there are a lot of them. There are a lot of requirements. That's not the point of this webinar. And in fact, we have another webinar coming up with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, just for immigration attorneys. If you want to know the details, you can look at ilrc.org to subscribe to that webinar. For this webinar, we're really just taking a broad view as to like what these options are and how employers can support in this area. So Dan, I have a few questions for you. Hopefully you can help us demystify some of this stuff. So Dan, first of all, I mentioned that a decision on DACA might not be until next year, 2025, but why is it important for DACA recipients and employers to begin exploring legalization options now?
Well, thanks, Krishna, and thanks, Rich and Kathy and everybody. A pleasure to be part of this. The reason is that employer-sponsored immigration options take time. Even in the best of all possible worlds, even with an employer who's done this before, or even with a relatively simple case, if there is such a thing in immigration, it still takes time, and often, in fact, most of the time, moving into longer term status through employer sponsorship involves travel outside the US, which also takes time to plan. So it's never too early to start these conversations. And one of the things Krishna and I and our team have found is that everybody's coming at this from a different place. But so, as I said, some employers may have done lots of employer sponsorship, but don't have a policy or an understanding of DACA. Some employers have just never done employer sponsorship and need to work through any concerns or questions that any stakeholders have, whether that's a union or a general counsel or an outside counsel, HR, supervisors, management, board of trustees, and so forth. So anyway, the short answer to your question is it takes time.
Great, thank you, Dan. And can we go to the next slide now, please? So yeah, I mean, so many people have heard about humanitarian or family-based immigration options. So for example, we often hear, you know, a DACA recipient can possibly get a green card if they have a US citizen spouse, and the US citizen spouse can petition for them. But does immigration law also allow employers to sponsor employees to obtain lawful status?
Yes, as Krishna's probably heard me say over and over again, immigration is a game of categories. So no matter who I'm talking to, whether it's somebody who comes in thinking they want a humanitarian visa or somebody who thinks they want an employment visa, we look at every category to try to see what's the best fit, because our immigration system is just a jumble of categories that were created by Congress and by administrations at different times for different reasons, and doesn't make a lot of sense. So yes, employers can sponsor employees. I think the key, really, there are two key pieces to evaluating that case. One is, what's the job, and does that job fit into an employer-sponsored category? And then the other question is, what is the individual's immigration history after the employer sponsorship? What will it take for that person to finish the process and move into status that way? And depending on the person's immigration history, it may be a little easier or a little harder.
And you mentioned sponsorship, we see it on the slide, but when we talk about an employer being able to sponsor an employee, what does that mean? Does that mean that employers can help DACA recipients who are working for them get another form of lawful status?
Yes, I mean, employers can help DACA recipients get another form of lawful status. In general, sponsoring, I think a good way to think about sponsoring is promises that are made to the government about the job and the employee. So H-1B sponsorship involves promises to the Department of Labor about what the job is and how much that person will be paid and how they will be treated compared to other employees. This is a very common process. So the first time, it may take some time to understand it, but it's easier than it sounds when it's first explained. But there are basically a series of promises that are made by the employer for the employee as part of the sponsorship.
You got it. Thank you, Dan. Next slide, please. So we know that many participants on this webinar are coming from nonprofits, schools, government agencies. And so when we're looking at employment-based immigration visas, are there advantages to these types of entities who are seeking to sponsor employees?
Yes, and definitely. There are really two tools we have most commonly for employer sponsorship. One is a temporary H-1B professional working visa, and the other is permanent residence or a green card. For the H-1B temporary visa, there are a limited number, and there's a lottery for private companies, and only about 20% of people who try to get an H-1B through the lottery are successful. The Biden administration had put out some proposed regulations later last year. We think those are going to be coming out pretty soon. We worked with Krishna and ILRC and others to comment on those, to say that please make the exceptions from the lottery for nonprofits and schools and government agencies as broad as possible. So when that new regulation comes out, we're going to read it really carefully. But bottom line is, most nonprofit schools and government agencies can sponsor H-1Bs outside of the lottery, which means they can sponsor anytime they want instead of once a year having a 21% or 20% chance of getting one.
And when we look at nonprofits and these types of entities, why do you think that we don't hear more about them sponsoring their employees for work visas? I kind of gave some answers. Is it that DACA recipients and employers often don't even know that they can sponsor, or that nonprofits can sponsor DACA recipients? Is it that hiring an attorney who has experience in employment-based immigration remedies is usually expensive? And given that these are nonprofits, it's usually not in their budget to hire an attorney with that expertise. Is it that nonprofit legal service providers who are often screening for other types of relief like family-based, humanitarian, don't generally screen from employment-based immigration options? What do you think, Dan?
All of the above. So and just I'll tell you a very, very quick story. So years ago, we were working with a law school, and we found that international law school graduates were going to work for big firms to get H-1Bs, to get work sponsorship, because if they went to a public defender's office or a place like ILRC or a legal aid clinic, they weren't getting sponsorship. And so we were trying to bridge the gap. We want people to be working in nonprofits and schools and government agencies. So time and money, those are the big, whenever we talk to an employer, those are the things they want to know: time and money. How much time is it going to take us, and how much is it going to cost us? Thankfully, through our grant at Path to Papers at Cornell, we can help nonprofits, schools, government agencies with pro bono legal services. So it's just the filing fees and costs that they're paying. So that cuts down the costs a lot. And we'll try to make it as simple as possible. As a practical matter, the first time any employer does something like this, it does take a little extra effort, but it's really not too bad. So the big barriers are time, money, and knowledge. And we're trying to work through those barriers by providing free legal services, help make it efficient, and spread knowledge.
Great, thank you, Dan. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, our final slide, just to go over or reiterate some of what Dan just mentioned. So basically, Path to Papers is here to eliminate some of the barriers that we just discussed. So we're offering free legal consultations to DACA recipients and employers. So you can sign up to get those consultations. And then so what we're doing is assessing whether a person is eligible, not just for employment-based options, but obviously if you're eligible for other we want to make sure that DACA recipients are knowledgeable about what the different options that they have. But if we do find that a person is eligible for an employment-based option and you live in the Bay Area, and the employer is a nonprofit, college or university or government agency, we're helping them get connected to get representation for free. So we're here to support you all. If you all want a consultation, you can use our email listed on the slide right on your screen, intake@path2papers.org, and you can fill out an interest form from there. So with that, thank you all so much, and we'll pass it over to our colleagues. And Kathy, I don't know if you were going to take it back. Oh, just as.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll start. My name is Karen. I am with Justice Action Center, and we are going to talk a little bit about a specific advanced parole project that we are running called the Border Advocacy Training Project. And so because I have the helpful poll information, I know that many of you know about advanced parole, but not everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about advanced parole before I turn it over to my colleague Elia, who will talk about our specific program. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is advanced parole? I like to say that advanced parole is a little bit of magic. So we believe, of course, that all people should be able to travel for any reason. We know that, unfortunately, that is not the case for a lot of folks in different immigration statuses, but advanced parole provides DACA recipients with the opportunity to leave the country with advance permission to return and to maintain their DACA status, but for certain purposes only. The other thing that is beautiful about advanced parole, aside from just that basic right that we should all have to travel where we would like to go and to return in our status, is that for some DACA recipients, advanced parole can provide a lawful entry. Not all DACA recipients originally came to the United States with what would be considered a lawful entry, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about how advanced parole can help with that. So next slide, please. So here, like I said, if I was queen of the world, advanced parole would be available for DACA recipients for any purpose, even if it was, I just want to go see, the icebergs in Iceland, that would be a-okay. Unfortunately, I am not in charge of the world. And what we have is that you can apply for and receive advanced parole for three purposes: educational, employment, or humanitarian. And, one of our goals is to have the Biden administration be as expansive as possible when it considers what kind of trips would fit into each of these categories. So humanitarian, most of you have heard of. This is what people traditionally think of advanced parole. It is often to say goodbye to a relative who is in their final stages of life, or who is very sick, or to attend a funeral. This can be done on an emergency basis. Employment, generally, it can be all kinds of things. It can be overseas assignments, it can be a training or a meeting. And educational, that literally says in the USCIS materials that it's traditionally semester abroad programs, and that's awesome. But that's not the only thing that an educational trip can be. Semester abroad programs generally are only offered to students. They can be very long, they can be expensive. And so we believe, and we have had success with this, that something like going with us and our colleagues at Immigrant Defenders Law Center to volunteer at migrant shelters in Tijuana can be educational and provides a way for more people to do advanced parole trips. Next slide, please. I think those might be the end of my slides. Nope, this is the last one. And then I'm going to turn it over to Elia. So I had mentioned before that advanced parole can provide a lawful entry. So if you or one of your work colleagues or one of your loved ones is a DACA recipient who originally came into the country without a lawful entry or without a visa, even if they are already qualified for a family immigration visa. So for example, they are married to a US citizen, or they have a sibling who is a US citizen, or a parent, they can't actually adjust status and get their green card because they don't have a lawful entry into the United States. What is so lovely about advanced parole is it can solve that problem. The words of the statute actually require someone to be admitted or paroled. And when you come back on advanced parole, you get a stamp showing that you were paroled. And so one of the reasons why we started the project that we did, that both Elia and Rico will talk about, is because we wanted to make sure that as many DACA recipients as possible had the right to travel and and go with us on these trips if they would like to, while we still know that's in place, and so that we can improve the status in the sense of giving lawful entries to DACA recipients who may not have them while we can. Even if DACA goes away, someone with an advanced parole stamp has that parole stamp. And if they either now or in the future become eligible for a family-based visa, that can help them on the path to permanent residence. And that's something that we thought was extremely important to do now. So I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Elia, who's going to talk more specifically about our program.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. Karen has given you all an overview of what advanced parole is as a process that allows participants or DACA recipients to request, a permission to travel and return to the U.S. But as she mentioned, DACA recipients need to fulfill this, reasons for travel under 3 categories. Those are employment, education, and humanitarian reasons. And the Justice Action Center, in partnership with Immigrant Defenders Law Center, launched the Border Advocacy Training Project as both a training opportunity and a volunteer experience for DACA recipients to be able to unlock that process to request advanced parole for both employment and education reasons. We launched this project in the fall, began recruiting participants, submitting applications, and we had our first trip to Tijuana this past March 8th with Rico, who we have invited and who will be sharing his experience with the process later on. But if we go into the next slide, I can go into the details about what the project entails. So as we mentioned, we have created this project to be able to allow participants, specifically DACA recipients, to apply for advanced parole. So our program is open to all DACA recipients who have current valid DACA status. Just because that is a requirement to be able to request advanced parole, you must have DACA. And the trip is organizing one-day volunteer trips to Tijuana to volunteer at a migrant shelter. Participants will be able to participate in Know Your Rights presentations, interact with asylum seekers, visit several, key locations along the U.S. border, for example, the Deported Veterans Building. And, every trip may have a different experience because we have various partnerships with different migrant shelters, but they are all located within walking distance of the U.S. border. Trips are occurring on a monthly basis in cohorts of 5 to 10 DACA recipients. We are currently traveling with, DACA recipients, about 5 to 10 in groups, but they are accompanied by both staff from Immigrant Defenders Law Center and Justice Action Center, who are the trip organizers and are accompanying participants to ensure that they're able to leave the U.S. and return safely. Participants are currently meeting the trip organizers in San Diego. We commute as a group to the border and cross into Mexico through the pedestrian crossing. Once we, reach Tijuana, as I mentioned, all of our migrant shelter partnerships are within walking distance to the border. So we walk to the migrant shelter, carry out the activities, and return to the U.S. on the same day. And in terms of costs, there is no cost to participate in the program itself. We are helping participants with their advanced parole applications, filling them out, getting all the supplemental evidence, and submitting their applications to OCEIA. And although there is no cost to participate in the program, participants can expect to incur travel and accommodation costs if they're traveling out of state to meet us in Tijuana. And in addition to travel costs, they can expect to incur the OCEIA filing fees. And this is a fee that OCEIA charges participants to be able to request advanced parole. That fee is going up to $630 this April 1st for applications submitted on April 1st. We are encouraging participants as much as possible to seek assistance from their employers for both travel and filing fee costs. But in the event that the participant nor the employer can cover these costs, we do have limited filing fee scholarships available for participants. We set up this program to be able to remove as many barriers for participants to be able to participate in advanced parole. Given the uncertainty of DACA, this may be the last chance for many participants to be able to get that legal entry that would allow them to, apply for a green card and to legalize their status in the future, which is why we have removed any financial barriers for participants. There is no program costs. And in terms of time, it's a one-day volunteer experience for participants who are not able to engage in semester-long study abroad programs or who can't cover the cost of a semester-long study abroad program. And in the next slide, we are introducing Rico, who is our participant of the Border Advocacy Training Project. He's going to share a little bit about his experience participating in the project. But to introduce him, Rico, if you could tell us about yourself and your experience with DACA, and if you can, mention any benefits that you have received from the program.
Yeah, no, thank you. And hello, everybody. My name is Ricardo Luján Valerio, but everybody calls me Rico. So feel free to, and Chad, if you have questions or whatever, Rico, it's what I go by, he, him, his. I am an Oregonian. I have the benefit of being able to work at Western Oregon University as their Director of Government Relations. And I've been doing political work, policy work for over 10 years now, actually. I am also a DACA recipient, and I had the privilege of being able to go into this advanced parole trip with the team at JAC and MDEV on early March. It was fantastic. I was born in 1994 in Nezahualcóyotl, Mexico. My family and I moved to the U.S. In 2003. My dad had already been here, but it was my mom, my sister, 5 years older than me, and myself who were still in Mexico. And when things were kind of picking up in terms of economic hardships and a bit of the cartel violence in Guanajuato, which is where we were living, my dad decided to bring the rest of the family up north. I had a pretty intense experience coming into the US. I was actually separated from my mom and my sister for quite some time in the process, and wasn't released to my dad until he was able to pay additional money to the Coyotes. And so it was a very traumatic experience. And I think for me at 9 years old at that time, it was a moment of reckoning. It was in many ways how my childhood was stripped, but also an aha moment of, okay, the world is not pretty. It's not what you thought it was, and you got to be careful. And so I, throughout the years growing up, had a sense of what it all meant, but it wasn't until I became a teenager that it all kind of dawned on me of like, oh, I can't get a driving permit. I can't get a driver's license. This is all hitting me now. This is why mom and dad were always scared of law enforcement. If we ever got pulled over, why my mom would turn pale when she saw a police officer. And so I got activated at a very young age. That, along with, the hardships of trying to afford higher education as undocumented, kind of just escalated. And I was able to meet really wonderful people in Southern Oregon that took me under their wings and taught me a lot of things about immigration law, certainly a lot of things about sharing my own personal story. And that's allowed me to do a lot of this work of policy and political work for over 10 years now. If it weren't for DACA, I would not be where I am today. I would not be able to have graduated college. I would not have been able to do political work to the degree that I am doing it while being able to sustain my whole family. I was very fortunate and privileged enough to be able to buy my house in Oregon, which for me, my dream was always to buy my mom and dad a home. Knowing that even though, the reality of the quistas is even tougher, my parents, who are the original dreamers, their chances of ever seeing some sort of reform is even slimmer. So finding that security for them and being able to call a place actually their own home was a significant milestone for me. And it would not have been possible at all if it weren't for DACA. So it certainly means a lot to me.
Thank you, Rico, for sharing your story. And in terms of participating in the program, what motivated you to do advanced parole through the Border Advocacy Training Project?
Yeah. So I do have to give a quick shout out to Jack and MDEF. Both of these organizations not only are providing a really awesome opportunity for Laquistas to be able to, as Karen mentioned, adjust potentially their status through eliminating that barrier of entry without inspection. But I think beyond that, it gave me the ability to go back to my home country for the first time in 20 years. It was really hard to even be thinking about the legal implications that it gave me moving forward. I was very much into what the experience would actually be to be with community again in Tijuana. And even though I wasn't born there, just being able to have that affinity with the community was something that I hadn't experienced before. And certainly not in 20 years. I remember growing up in Mexico, and that feeling felt real again for me. And it was really impactful. It was life-changing. I told the group when we were walking, I don't even remember the first 30 minutes of us crossing the border because it just impacted me so much. And the moment that it hit me, it was when we were actually walking and I saw the Mexican flag flying, and I just started crying. I couldn't control it. I couldn't stop. But for me, it was being able to be in community. I knew the kind of work that we were going to be doing, going to Tijuana, working with asylum seekers, working with people that are in need. And for me, I've always dedicated a lot of my professional career in helping my community here in Oregon. If I could take anything that I've learned in helping my community in Oregon down to the border for those that are seeking asylum down there, then I'm there for it. I'm wanting to be there. And so it was a double experience for me. That personal experience certainly, but most importantly for me, the experience of just being with community and helping people.
Great. And we've discussed a little bit about the process of applying for advanced parole first and then being able to travel with us. Can you tell us about what the process looked for you? And what kind of support did you receive for the application process and the travel component?
I received a lot of support, thankfully. I will say, and certainly in this call with the folks that we have been able to express a little bit of our own experiences like Laquistas. It's also kind of surreal because I do feel like it's not your typical Laquista experience either. And so I feel very privileged and fortunate to have had a lot of people around me in my life that are attorneys, that are community advocates, that are, political leaders that I relied on and gave me a huge safety net. And I do realize that is not possible for a lot of people, for most people for that matter. And so having people at Jack and MDEF that can really cater to folks that might not know that they have these avenues and have the support and people proactively telling them to try this out, it's huge. It's really, really huge. And so for me, the application process was very smooth. It was mainly me gathering my documents and trusting the team of attorneys that were supporting me in the application process. The most that I had to do in that time was really just answer questions to the attorneys and sign the documents and send them in. The nerve-wracking part for me, and specifically for this program, was were they going to accept me because I'm going to be doing humanitarian work for the political dynamics right now? Will they accept me in going down there and doing humanitarian work? And they did. And so I'm really grateful for that. The time frame in which my approval came in the mail to when the deadline was happening was very unfortunate. So I received my letter in late February. I think it was the last week of February, and I had to make the trip before March 12th. So it was within a 2-week period that I really had to make a decision of like, oh my gosh, is this possible? Can we do this? And typically you want a little bit more time. I really appreciated Karen, Lindsay, Melissa, Stephen Manning from Innovation Law Lab, all the folks that really were able to say, yes, let's do it. Let's get you down here. Let's get through this. Despite that challenge, that timeline challenge, y'all still made it happen. And so for me, I feel like I got all the support that gave me confidence to be able to go through the process, gave me confidence that I had a great group of leaders and experts to really guide me through the challenges, and really also dispel a lot of fears that I had in my head. I think, you know, as a DACista, you're used to a lot of the turmoil. You're used to being in the twilight zone. And even though you have to apply for DACA renewals every 2 years, and you know, for the most part, nothing's changed. So you feel like it should just be an easy renewal. That still hangs over your head. It's like, oh my gosh, what did they deny me this time? Like, did I do something wrong? Like, there's always that fear. And so for me, that was no different for advanced parole. There's always that inherent fear. But having the team to really just support me and dispel a lot of the things, and being super communicative, saying, if you have any questions, any thoughts, just express them and we'll help you through it. That made it possible for me to like just emotionally be able to go through the whole thing. So yeah, I got all the support that I needed, and I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Rico. And, you mentioned kind of some of the fears that you had, and, the process was nerve-wracking. But what advice do you have for DACA recipients or employers who are looking to support their employees with advanced parole?
Yeah, so for DACistas, I would encourage folks to really ask as many questions as possible to the resources that are around you. Don't be shy. There is no wrong question. There is no wrong comment. There is no unjustified feeling, even if it feels irrational. Again, we've been living in this twilight zone since 2012, and in some ways it feels very numbing. In other ways, it just keeps that constant fear. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to feel those feelings, and ask a lot of questions. To employers that are able to find avenues to support DACistas, it can look in many different ways. I think we talked about advanced parole today. We talked about potential adjustment of status, even just finding renewal funds for DACA. Sometimes it's really hard to come up with the filing fee and for potential legal representation for refiling renewals. If you can at least even help your DACista or legal presence employees in your organization, that goes a long way. It goes a very long way. And certainly be proactive in trying to reach out to different resources near you on how you can continue to be proactive in helping your immigrant employees. And I will also add an additional layer, just because we do have government folks here. Having the resources to be able to make this happen is also super important. So to the extent the community can continue to advocate for cities, counties, the state to fund these programs in a way of universal representation or direct funding for these things to really just be resourced and lower the financial barrier for people to participate, please do so. It's super, super important. I know a little bit of how those things are realized was covered in the introduction of this webinar. Those are essential, because again, not a lot of people do have the resources to be able to afford a flight last minute to make the travels happen. And to the wonderful organizations that can offer scholarships, the more that we can provide them that avenue to give to their participants, the better. So those are just some of the things that kind of come to mind first.
Thank you so much, Rico. Thank you for sharing your story and for sharing your advice with us. In the next slide, I hope you can stick around if there are any questions, if anyone has questions for you as an individual participant. But I will go over how you can express interest in the program. We are accepting requests for participation in our program on a rolling basis. If you are a DACA recipient who would like to sign up for either a Q&A session to learn more about the program, or sign up for an intake to assess your eligibility for advanced parole, we do have a booking page. Our links are there, but we can also share our information. You can sign up for a Q&A session with me, and we'll go over just the more intricate details about the program as a participant. And if you are an employer seeking to support your employees through advanced parole, you can also sign up for a Q&A session, learn more about the program and what you can do as an employer to support your employees. And if anyone does have any further questions, my email is there listed, so that if you have any questions, you can reach out, and I'm happy to talk about it. I know we do have some space for questions, so I'll give it back to Kathy for the Q&A portion.
Hi there. Okay, so we are first going to throw out a quick poll that is going to help our panelists understand a little bit about how you are receiving this information. So Melissa's going to be doing that. And while we are doing that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Krishna. We see that most of the questions are related to employment-based questions and are going to be best answered by the Path to Papers team. So Krishna, I'm going to let you take on these. Krishna, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. That often happens. So I gathered all the questions that were asked about the employment-based options, and maybe Dan, you can help us answer these. But one of them seems to be around just overall success rates. Obviously, Path to Papers is fairly new, but I know you've also done a lot of these in the past and have worked with schools and other of these entities like nonprofits. But can you give us some sense of, what percentage might be eligible for these options, kind of maybe some success stories that you've seen?
Sure. So I think the initial consultation with the employer and the employee is really key. But of what we found over the years for people with DACA or who are is that I would say probably 20 to 25% have some kind of employer-sponsored option and an immigration history that will allow us to finish that. The other thing is that's right now. The other thing is that we can often plant seeds. So we talk to a lot of people who are still in school, still in college, or still in grad school, who wouldn't be eligible yet because they don't have the employer, but we can talk to them about how to get ready, how to talk to an employer about that, what kinds of jobs might work for them, and make it work. So it does work. It is very much case by case. I think, I've heard a lot of folks who work on these issues say, only Congress can really fix the problem and create a one-size-fits-all solution for dreamers. What we're doing is really taking a deep dive into every person's situation and trying to figure out a path forward. But it really does work. And you asked about an example. We were working with a school teacher who had been on DACA for years. Her school didn't know she was DACA because she just shows up with a work card, so they didn't think anymore about it. They love her. She does special ed. She works in an area of Massachusetts with a lot of people from Brazil. She's from Brazil. She speaks Brazilian Portuguese, so she's just lovely. And she was nervous about talking to the school. The school, when we did talk to her principal, he was very interested. We talked to the union, we talked to HR. It took probably 6 months of conversations for people to get comfortable with this. They had never sponsored anybody before for anything, not DACA. But she was eligible for green card sponsorship. It took about 2 years, and now she and her husband, who was fully undocumented, have green cards and all the things that Licia was talking about, can visit family, don't have to think day by day. So it does work, but again, deep dive into each person's situation and often multiple conversations to make sure the employee and the employer are both comfortable with this whole project.
Yeah, that's right. And I would also add that this is also a population that has continued to, a lot of them have renewed their DACA since it was first announced in 2012 by themselves, or without seeking help from an attorney. So what we're also seeing is DACA recipients who are coming to an immigration attorney for the first time in many years, and are being assessed for, we're finding that they're eligible for other options and outside of employment-based. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But someone else, they seem to be, I think they're a little bit confused. They think that everyone has to go through the lottery as one of the requirements for employment-based options. Is that true that everyone has to, when we're thinking about employment-based green cards or the different types of non-immigrant visas, does everyone have to go through a lottery?
No, and that's a good question. There is no lottery for green cards. They can be done for any type of long-term, full-time position. The only people who have to go through a lottery are people who want a temporary H-1B working visa and are working for a for-profit employer.
Got it. Thank you. And then someone else asked 245I. I think some people know what that is. For those who don't know, maybe just a quick reminder about what that is. But someone asked specifically, can that help when we're looking at these options?
Yes, it can. So 245I is basically an old amnesty program. It wasn't called an amnesty program, but that's what it was. And what it says is that if a green card was started for the person, or for that person's parents, or in some cases for that person's grandparents, before April 30th, 2001, then that can help that person, that can make the green card process easier even. And the details are complicated, but when we do screening, we ask, was a green card ever started for you, your parents, or your grandparents? Even if it didn't go anywhere, even if it was just filed and didn't work. And then if that is the case, we may be able to use that to make the green card now significantly easier.
Great, thank you. And I see a lot of questions that are very specific about like what makes a person eligible or not. So for those of you, I just invite you all to submit to email us at interest@path2papers.org so we can just dive into the details and do a consultation with you, because it really does depend on each individual circumstance. So do that. But there are a few last minute questions.
I'll just say, Krisha, that email is intake@path2papers.org, not interested.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Interest@path2papers.org.
No, intake.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
sorry.
It's in the chat too. Yeah.
Okay. Intake@path2papers.org. Someone is asking when applying for employment-based options, does the employee have to stay with their employer forever?
Not forever, but through the process. So, we do talk to a fair number of people who just, are in transition or looking for other jobs. An H-1B process, probably would be a temporary H-1B working visa would probably be a 6 to 12 month project. A green card, usually a 2 to 3 year project. So if an employee is not planning to stay with an employer for that length of time, then it makes sense to keep in touch and wait until the employee is a little more settled.
Got it. And you mentioned a few already. You mentioned H-1B, green card. But can you generally talk about, when we're looking at nonprofits specifically, what are the most common remedies that nonprofits can pursue to try to legalize their DACA recipient workers?
Yeah, well, we do look at everything. The old immigration is a game of categories. So, there's a special green card for nurses, for community health centers. We do a fair amount of those. But in general, for most of you, or for most nonprofits, the H-1B is a visa for jobs that require at least a bachelor's degree in a particular field. So if somebody has a bachelor's in marketing and is doing marketing, if somebody has a bachelor's in graphic design and is managing the website, if somebody has a master's in urban planning and is working at a planning organization, bottom line is, if the job requires at least a 4-year degree in a field, the H-1B is worth talking about. That's a temporary visa. The green card can be for any job that is full-time without a fixed end date. So not a fellowship that ends in 2 years, but if it's full-time and the job doesn't have a definite end, it could continue, then that could be a green card.
Great, thank you, Dan. And I think those are all the questions that I see on employment-based options? I know there are a few for our colleagues at Justice Action Center, so maybe y'all want to take those on.
I think there's just one, but maybe Elia, you can tell me if we've got another one to answer. I think the question that we have to answer is if someone has advanced parole and they're coming back into the country, can they still be denied entrance? The answer is yes. However, so yes, right? You can still be denied entrance in the discretion of Border Patrol. However, that is why we think it's really important to have a lawyer who's helping you with advanced parole, who will be screening to make sure that there would not be issues that would occur with your reentry. And that is something that we are doing through our process. So to be clear, advanced parole gets issued like Rico was describing. They say you can't leave the country before this date and you have to come back by this time. And so long, I have been doing advanced parole for DACA recipients since the Obama administration, like literally hundreds of them. So long as you don't violate that and you have been appropriately pre-screened, we've never seen an issue, right? It's not like the whims of border control can deny you the re-entrance, and certainly under this president, and this is why we have lawyers who are with you when you're coming back in the country. If something did go sideways, though it never has, we have the ability to advocate with this administration. Right. And that's why, again, we're trying to do as many of these as possible while we know that President Biden is still the president. So the kinds of things that could lead Border Patrol to deny someone a reentry is something like a criminal conviction that had occurred after your last DACA renewal and had not been disclosed, but is coming up in their database. Again, all stuff that we're screening for ahead of time. But we recognize that it is scary to, if you've spent many years or even decades being told you're not allowed to leave the country, that coming back through Border Patrol and being sent to secondary inspection, which occurs to every DACA recipient traveling on advanced parole, is a nerve-wracking experience. And that's why it's something we talk about beforehand and make sure that you're accompanied with lawyers. Is there anything else, Elia, that you think we needed to answer? I know you provided the information about how to sign up for an intake.
Yes, we have someone inquiring about the timeline it takes to approve an advanced parole application. And the timeline to process a request for advanced parole does vary throughout the year. It can be anywhere from 4 to 5 to 6 months, depending on USCIS caseloads. For Rico, for example, it took a process of 4 months from the moment he submitted his application to the moment he received his approval notice to be able to travel. And then once we do receive a travel permit, then we're able to schedule him on a trip for him to be able to travel with us on a trip to Tijuana. So the process varies, and there's no guarantee that they may be able to get approved by a certain deadline. But we are working with participants to be able to schedule them into a trip when they are approved and they have their travel document in hand.
And I see in the chat that, once again, I think some folks are wondering whether they're individually qualified for an employment-based option. So once again, I just invite you all to submit an email to intake@path2papers.org, and then we can just do a consultation with you all for free.
Yeah, so great. Thank you to our panelists for taking a lot of those questions. There, I know some of you probably are noting that your question has not been answered yet. There are some questions that are too specific for us to really be able to answer in a group setting. As Krishna said, we encourage you to get an individual consult. And I'll note that that can happen in many different ways. So if you are an employer, you can set up a consult without your DACA employee. You might not even know if you have DACA employees, and you could strategize with our team. How do I even know if I have a DACA employee? I'm not sure. I don't see that information. People are not disclosing that. I haven't had conversations yet about that. So we could even have that as a starting point to the conversation. On the other hand, an employer might come to us and say, I have 20 DACA employees. I don't even know how to begin this process. That's overwhelming to me. I don't, they're all in different statuses, have different histories. I need to figure out how I would even begin that process in a, from a values or transparency perspective. So we could begin on with that kind of conversation. You could be a DACA employee here, and you could say, "Have never talked to my employer. I don't even know if they would go for this. How do I test the waters and even know how to begin this conversation? I don't feel safe talking about this. What happens if they penalize me? What happens if I try to convince them that DACA is unstable and they don't promote me because of that?" You could have that kind of conversation with our attorney team. You could also have a conversation like, "I want to leave in a year. Is it even worth beginning this process with my current employer?" So we can have confidential conversations with just an employee or just an employer, or you could be ready to talk together. An employer and an employee could come in at the same time and talk. So again, the first step for most of you is to schedule an intake. The Path to Papers team and the Justice Action team are in coordination. So that if the Path to Papers team understands that advanced parole is really the thing to start with, might be the easiest and fastest and most direct, we will make sure you get to Justice Action Center and Justice Action Center if they realize that an employment-based option is really the best thing for you. They will refer to Path to Papers, and we will both refer to other providers if there might be a family-based or humanitarian option that is more direct too. So we are definitely, you have two providers here, but they are working as part of a team of more people. And we just encourage you to reach out. Do not let expertise or capacity or cost be a barrier right now. We are really trying to remove those obstacles. So with that, we're at time, and I'll just turn it over to Rich to say the final word here.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you to all of our presenters for the amazing content that you brought, and thank you everyone for attending. I just wanted to note that when I'm looking in the participant list and attendee list, I know there are so many folks who are ready to consider this, who are DACA recipients that we've come to know through our work. So please, all of you, email the intake address that you see here. If you need help, you can also reach out to me or to our office. And I also wanted to note that there are so many of our nonprofit partners that are here, and I wanted to thank you for being here and considering this. We really feel that it's so important that all of the amazing community groups here that rely on the work and sweat of our DACA recipients to hold your work together, we're going to hold you accountable. I'm going to follow up with y'all because I see matches here in the attendee list of folks who have DACA and their employer right here on this webinar. So I really want to make sure that we help give you the resources you need. Just the last thing I want to flag is that there were a lot of technical questions. The goal of this webinar was not to make you experts. It's just to let you know that there are free resources to help you not have to be the expert so that we can get this done for you. And that goes for employers or DACA recipients themselves. So please don't be overwhelmed if you feel like you are getting inundated with information. The wonderful folks here are so generously offering their wisdom and their service. So everybody here, please do take advantage.
And Rich, we will jointly work on a follow-up email, which will include more resources and links and contact information for everyone.
Great. Thank you again, Kathy, and everyone, all of our presenters, and everyone for being here on a Friday afternoon. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll follow up via email and a recording of this webinar. Take care.